let's turn to the subject of today's event, which is on the entitled "The Settlement Freeze and the Peace Process Freeze." And this is an event that we had planned for some time now with the deadline on the 26th in mind. And of course, we did not know what the decision of the Israeli government was going to be and how that was going to impact the process. And so we were thinking about putting together an event that could discuss the implications of that decision, regardless to what it would be, and talk about how this would affect negotiations, if negotiations will continue at all. Of course, as you likely know, the Israeli government decided not to extend the settlement freeze. I should note that this was a settlement freeze that really didn't do much to slow down settlement construction to begin with. Nonetheless, many had recognized it as an immediate and significant obstacle to the peace talks restarted in early September here in Washington, D.C. So I'm happy to welcome our guests today, Michele, Dunne, Nadia, Hijab, and Dan Levy. Dan apologized and says he was going to be a few minutes late, so we're hoping he'll join us shortly. And I'm going to begin by introducing Michele and Nadia. Michele Dunne was a former specialist at the State Department and White House on Middle East affairs, and she served in assignments including the National Security Council staff, the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, and the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, as well as the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. She has a PhD in Arabic language and literature from Georgetown University, where she is also an adjunct professor of Arab studies. And seated next to her, we're pleased to welcome Nadia Hijab as well. She is co-director of the Al-Shabaka, a Palestinian policy network, and a frequent public speaker and media commentator. She also serves as a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Her book, Woman Power, The Arab Debate on Women at Work, was published by Cambridge University Press, and she co-authored as well Citizens Apart, A Portrait of Palestinians in Israel. She's editor-in-chief as well of the London-based Middle East magazine before joining the United Nations. So please join us in welcoming our panel. I'm going to turn it over at this point to Michele for introductory comments, and afterwards we'll move into Q&A once our panelists are finished.
Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you to the Palestine Center for inviting me. As I was telling Yusuf before we began today, I had a particularly hard time figuring out what I wanted to say today, because I'm unlike a lot of, I think, think tank people in Washington, I try not to be a professional cynic, and I try to, I try to see the possibilities and things and so forth. But I think we're clearly at a very, very discouraging moment. I think that Nadia tells me she's going to be talking a bit about how things look from a Palestinian point of view, and I know that when Daniel comes, he'll have some very enlightening things to say about what's going on in Israel. I'm just going to make a few general remarks about how I see this situation right now, with a view toward kicking off discussion. So, following the expiration of this moratorium, or, what I think of as a kind of limits, there were some limits placed on settlement construction over the last 10 months. As I'm sure you're aware, basically what happened was that the Israelis said that they would allow the completion of a certain number of units, over 3,000 housing units in the West Bank that had been started in the great rush to get housing units started before the moratorium, but that they would not allow new starts, and they would not be giving permits to new projects. So that is now what has expired. And following that expiration, I would say that the peace talks have not yet been blown out of the water, in the sense that President Abbas has not yet formally withdrawn, but they are certainly dead in the water. As the State Department spokesman said yesterday, there are no direct talks scheduled right now, and the U.S. envoy George Mitchell is back in the region shuttling between the parties. Does this sound familiar? This is where we were, we're kind of back where we were a couple of months ago. So, where will this unfortunate episode lead us? Sort of a number of possibilities. It's entirely possible that there will be some kind of package of Israeli measures that will be put together to kind of appease President Abbas and convince him to resume. I won't even say continue, because I think right now direct talks are off, but to resume direct talks while settlement construction will go ahead. Again, there could be a new package of some kind of limits. Clearly, a real freeze is not in the offing. And there could be other gestures as well. We all know what they are, the usual confidence-building measures, a phrase that always makes my heart sink because it means that the negotiations are not going anywhere. But, the usual things. Not that they're not meaningful. They can be meaningful in terms of lifting restrictions on movements in the West Bank, releasing prisoners, and so forth. But they're, we'll see whether that's clearly, what's under discussion now. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. Indeed, I think it's possible we'll have a prolonged period where we sort of stay where we are, where talks are, where the Palestinian side has not formally withdrawn from talks, but talks are not resumed, and the shuttle diplomacy goes on. And then there's also the possibility of a kind of drastic break in the process. And a real Palestinian withdrawal. However, and I don't know, I think I can't tell right now what's going to happen, which of these things are going to happen. But what I can say is this: I think there are two outcomes that are pretty much inevitable, whichever way this shakes out. One of them, I think, is a significant further weakening of the Palestinian side. In the negotiations. We already know, and it's been widely discussed, the kind of asymmetry that it's been apparent for a long time, but it's even more apparent nowadays than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the asymmetry in strength between the Israeli and Palestinian sides. And again, it's hard to say, as the Palestinian side becomes weakened and more weakened, it's hard to say where that's going to end up, where it's going to go. But I don't think it's going toward a negotiated agreement. I don't think that's in favor. Even if you're just set aside who's right, who's wrong, just look at it purely like can these sides negotiate an agreement? And I really think that at this point, it's becoming difficult to the point of impossible. The Palestinian side, as you're aware, is disunited because of the rift between Fatah and Hamas, and utterly dependent on outside parties, specifically the United States and Europe, for financial and diplomatic and other kinds of support. And I think these two factors alone make it very, very difficult for President Abbas to have the kind of flexibility that he would need to conduct real negotiations. And that's even if there were in place an Israeli government that wanted an agreement, which of course there is not. So, we're getting to a point of real, extreme weakness, I think, on the side of the Palestinian negotiators. The other outcome that I see, unless someone pulls a rabbit out of a hat this week, is diminished credibility of the U.S. negotiators. I think that it really looks very bad at this point that the United States staged this big ceremony just a few weeks ago, the White House, the State Department, and so forth. And everyone knew that this problem was out there waiting for us. Everybody, on September 1st, every journalist was asking, what about September 26th? What's going to happen? Everybody knew that there was a disaster waiting to happen. And the fact that there was not a solution of some kind wired to, I think, is very surprising to stage what was staged in Washington a few weeks ago, knowing that it was in very serious danger of collapsing so quickly. It seems to reflect a lack of strategic thinking on the part of the U.S. negotiators, which I think was also evident in the first year of the Obama administration, when the United States pressed Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu for a settlement freeze that he was not going to give, without having a backup plan for what they were going to do when he said no. Okay, so this is, that is exactly what, that lack of strategic at that juncture is what led us to the juncture we are at today. And that's not to say that I think the position that the Obama administration took on settlements was wrong. I think it was the right position, but I think it was not well thought through how to pursue this. Okay, I also think that it looks to me that in the last 6 months, a year or so, that the U.S. administration is becoming increasingly hostage to the process rather than to the substance. There have been a number of people talking about this. Aaron Miller, one of the former negotiators and so forth, has said a lot of things about this that I think are correct. And this has tended to happen to U.S. administrations, that at a certain point they are sort of sacrificing a lot of principles and substance just to get to the next negotiating thing. I mean, in the last year or so, the whole holy grail of direct negotiations, and have to sacrifice everything to get there. For what? For what's the promise of something that these negotiations will yield something? So I have to say, I think in the first year of the Obama administration in pursuing this issue was kind of all principles and no strategy, and then in the second year there's been all process and no strategy, and we're still not in a good situation. I just want to point out one other thing. I think there is one lesson here that needs to be learned for the long term, and that it's difficult to implement, but I and some other people have been writing about this. There's a price to be paid for ignoring difficult problems and letting them fester. Okay, the settlements issue has been around for 40 years, and it's been the subject of intense U.S. concern on and off for 20 years, right? But it kept being dropped repeatedly into the what I call the too hard box. Okay, and that has happened again now, and now we see how in that too hard box the size of the problem has grown and grown tremendously. I have to say, I think there's another issue on which the U.S. is doing this at the same time, and that is the Palestinian reconciliation question, which has been festering now since 2007. And I think the U.S. has definitely put that in the too hard box. Not that it's up to the United States to somehow fix that, but at least to have a constructive attitude toward it being fixed by Palestinians. The United States has really wanted to avoid this issue. So there are some intriguing signs out of Damascus this week that Fatah and Hamas are talking again and maybe serious about it. We'll see. It's really too early to know if they're going anywhere. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Michele.
Just go ahead. Okay. All right. Well, again, thanks very much for inviting me here. It's good to be back in one of my old haunts. I think Michele has hit a lot of issues, hit the nail on the head. And as she said, I would like to look at this from a Palestinian perspective. First of all, you really have to recognize that Israel has been extremely successful in its framing of the issue. I mean, it's kept attention focused on the settlements and what to do about the settlements, not only, since obviously September 1st, but for the last 10 months, and long before. Which is a sidetracking of an issue and taking yet another red herring, having taken many red herrings over the years to distract attention from what's happening. So it focused all the media attention on the issue of freezing the settlement instead of what's actually going on the ground. There's been some coverage of what's going on the ground, but not very much. And I'm sure many in this audience know the horrors of what's going on, the continuous swallowing of Palestinian land and water resources, the continuous what's known as the Judaization of Jerusalem, home demolitions hit a peak during the settlement freeze, wall continues to be built, expulsions are underway, and this, I don't even want to call it a phenomenon, but the strategy of settler violence, which has made the West Bank such a dangerous place to live, maybe as dangerous as some of the major Israeli offensives against the West Bank. So all this is going on, and meanwhile, the whole attention of the international community is, oh, what do we do about the freeze? How can we get a freeze? A freeze that, as Michele said, and as Yusuf said, never took hold. So I think the PLO and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, have really put themselves deliberately. I mean, nobody pushed them there. They worked very hard to get U.S. recognition. They worked very hard for the peace process. And since 1993, they've left themselves with no alternatives to U.S. mediated negotiations, even though these are set up for failure, just by their very makeup. The concept that you have to have these two parties around the table it makes absolutely no sense, because Israel is, as we know, by far one of the strongest military powers in the world. It controls every single aspect of Palestinian lives under occupation, including whether they can even get to the negotiating table to talk to them. I mean, there was that one time when I think it was Abu al-Ala who was going to a meeting with Tzipi Livni, and they wouldn't let him through. I mean, so what are we talking about? Two sides or two parties when Israel has control of every single aspect. So effectively, what the PLO and the PA have done is put the Palestinians in the position of negotiating about the occupation, how much of their land they get to keep, and in with what possible elements of possible sovereignty, instead of actually working to end the occupation as a first step to solving other issues. And what's worse is that the U.S. has shown consistently over the decades that, if push comes to shove, it's willing, well, especially the last couple of decades, it's willing to put pressure, it's happy to put pressure on the weaker side, not on the stronger side, in order to make things happen. And there's every sign that this will happen again. And just to add to what Michele was saying, the Palestinian leadership feels so weak that instead of pulling out of negotiations as they had threatened if the settlement freeze resumed, they've gone running to the Arab League for political cover. I mean, that's how weak they are. So there are ways out of this trap. One way out of this trap, and it sounds like a pipe dream, but it is a way out of this trap, is to pull out of negotiations and to say, altogether, and to say that we actually have tried this experience of negotiating under occupation. Doesn't work. We have a good 19 years of caseload as precedent to prove that this does not work, and we don't want to negotiate under occupation anymore. Israel has to pull out completely before we go back to the negotiating table, and use that period to rebuild Palestinian strength and sources of power. It is very unlikely that the PLO-PA system would do this, and in this I would, even though it's not a member of the PLO, in this I would include probably Hamas. So yes, it's great if Hamas and Fatah come back together, but I don't know that they've developed any alternatives other than this U.S. mediated process, which has brought us to the brink of well, not to put too fine a point on it, almost extinction as a Palestinian people. So I think it's very unlikely that the PLO and PA would say, yeah, fine, we're not going to negotiate until the occupation is ended, and then we'll be happy to negotiate, what are the final status issues and sovereignty issues if there's going to be two states. Unlikely they will do this because they'll lose the international assistance, and they'll lose what little bits of power they have of the few pieces of the Palestinian people that remain in the little bits of Palestine that are left. So, several big challenges face the Palestinian people who would like to see alternative futures to what is on the table. One is to reframe the issue to focus on their rights under international law. Another is to keep a spotlight on what is actually going on the ground, not to be distracted by any of these red herrings that are out there, but say, look, this is the reality, here's the situation, it's an untenable situation. Third is to really rebuild their strength. And again, this is happening in some ways, and by the way, I'm an optimist. I don't, like you, I don't like to be cynical. I like to be optimistic and see what can be done, but not at the cost of not joining anything that's out there at the cost of actually achieving meaningful results. Palestinian strength is being rebuilt in many ways. One is through the popular struggle against the wall, which is being increasingly, which has been for a while, and it is being joined by Israeli Jews and internationals. One is through education and outreach to communities around the world. And one is through the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is really having an impact and putting a bit of a cost, both a moral, more of a moral cost than an economic cost, but even a bit of an economic cost to Israel's occupation. And as many people have said, unless there's a cost to Israel's occupation, it's unlikely to change or shift. Another thing in Palestinians' favor is the major changes that are happening, partly as a result of Israel's action, partly as a result of education and outreach in the U.S. and other Jewish communities. And I know people have been following the progress of the Jewish boat to Gaza, which has just been boarded and taken away by the Israeli Navy. But there are huge shifts that are enabling the Jewish communities to organize in a completely different way from the status quo. And perhaps the biggest challenge facing the Palestinian people, and I'll conclude with this, is what to do if negotiations, quote unquote, succeed. If people go back to the table, if their leaders go back to the table and negotiate under these extremely unfavorable terms of reference, to make it very clear that this process does not represent the Palestinians and does not represent the Palestinian people, and to speak out against that. So I'll stop there and pass it on to Daniel.
And I apologize for my tardiness in getting here, and especially to you, Michele, because I missed most of your comments, but I agreed with everything once I arrived. So unless the rest was totally different. And thank you for the invitation to appear here. Picking up on something that Nadia, you spoke about, I'd even, how is this whole question of the partial settlement moratorium being addressed? Yes, it's a success of an Israeli framing of this government, but it's also a Washington DC framing. And I think this is probably one of the least attractive instances of American exceptionalism. The way in which the debate here in this city just is taking place in such a different world from the reality in the Middle East. And look, the European statements do talk about the settlements as illegal. Now, I think there would probably be something to the idea of having a position in which settlements are defined by everyone as illegal. There are consequences for that, and at the same time, one can have a peace process while they're being built. I kind of think that would be less offensive than where we are today, which is in this game of make-believe. And that's where the peace process has been all along. And as you said, Michele, putting this into the box of too hard to deal with right now, you don't do any favors for yourself. In '93, when the famous handshake took place on the White House lawn and Oslo was launched, there were 111,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank alone, not including East Jerusalem. Today it's over 300,000. So, I mean, imagine if we were approaching these talks from that perspective, that we'd frozen it at 111,000. I think the deep skepticism that one could get anywhere with these talks would be, well, it would still be large because we've been going for 17 years, but I think it would be somewhat less. So the reality, of course, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not being asked to, nor is he agreeing to, extend a settlement freeze. Last November, Prime Minister Netanyahu came up with a series of exemptions, of get-out clauses. East Jerusalem and the 3,000 units under construction. So first of all, what we're being asked is to continue a Netanyahu-designed non-freeze. And that is what is not happening. Now, of course, and as Nadia pointed out, settlements are only a very significant, but still only a part of the story. Access to resources, access to land, you know it as well as I do. But by successfully creating this framing, you can have all kinds of absurdities, like the conversation going on in the Israeli press today, part of which is Israel didn't succeed in getting enough rewards for the partial moratorium put in place 10 months ago. And why won't Israel get more rewards if it does either extend or create new exemption clauses, but just not go crazy and build all the 21,000 units that one can immediately build? Or the most bizarre phenomenon, bizarre, although relatively easily explained, even though difficult to stomach, of a letter circulating, and I think it's at 87 signatories so far in the Senate, supporting the peace process and listing all the problems and the problems caused by the Palestinians. And there's one word that doesn't appear if you look at this letter that's signed by 87 senators. We're in a world without settlements. The one word that doesn't appear in a letter signed by 87 senators is the word settlements. And obviously we've been here before, and every time the conversation is, oh, come on, really? Over a couple of thousand units you're going to end the peace process? And of course what we invariably end up with is, at the end of whatever iteration of the peace process we're in, there's no deoccupation, but huge additional facts on the ground have been created. I remember when I worked in the Barak government, Ehud Barak said, what does it matter that I'm giving the housing ministry to the National Religious Party, to Yitzhak Levy, who was the then housing minister? And, well, it might not be the smartest idea, but the political logic was, well, we can keep the NRP, the National Religious Party, and as much of them with us for as long as possible, and even if they flee at the decisive moment, and even if they've built thousands of new housing units in the meantime, at least it gives me more political wiggle space. I mean, we even see the situation today where this is a coalition of the far right and the Labour fig leaf of choice, and it's interesting. I mean, I can obviously, living the Israeli political reality, I can understand why Tzipi Livni and Kadima, from inside an Israeli conversation, wouldn't come out and preemptively say full settlement freeze. Didn't come out and say it when the administration was talking that language a year plus ago, and haven't been saying it. But interesting, Livni has said we'll support any measure that would keep the talks going. But against that backdrop, it's really no wonder that there's such a credibility gap. I want to address 3 points. One is one has to understand the contemporary Israeli reality of settler and settler sympathizer power. political power and power on the ground. There are over 500,000 Israelis beyond the Green Line. 500,000 out of 7.5 million is already a sizable constituency. Not all of them are ideologically or religiously motivated to stay there, but this is a sizable constituency. And that's without the supporters, the sympathizers who live inside the Green Line. The settler movement has been smart. It's been easy for them, admittedly, but they've also been smart. So some years ago, you began to see the creation of settler communities in the territories, not even just in East Jerusalem, but in the West Bank, specifically designed to cater for the overflow of the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem. The fastest growing settlements today, Beitar Elite and Modin Elite, are explicitly catered to the ultra-Orthodox community. The ultra-Orthodox community weren't settlers. The Kippas Sruga, the knitted skullcap national religious community, of course, have been at the forefront of the settler movement all along. But the ultra-Orthodox were not. What did that do? That brought you two not insignificant political parties inside the Israeli Knesset as crucial opponents of any problem for settlement or settlement expansion, and of crucial supporters. The United Torah Judaism Party, Aguda, and the Shas Party, which cumulatively, I think that's 16 seats in today's Knesset. And again, that's a significant additional block. The settlers have obviously made a move to be right at the heart of the Likud in a sign-up campaign for Likud primaries. You obviously have the price tag policy that was has been pursued by the settlers in terms of attacks on Palestinians as a consequence of Israeli government actions vis-a-vis the settlers. So if the Israeli government does something that is considered unsympathetic by the settlers, the consequences will be borne by the Palestinian civilian population. You obviously have the trauma created by the Gaza withdrawal, both at the time and ever since, this narrative of the deep fissure in the fabric of Israeli society created by Gaza withdrawal. Many, I would argue by choice, of the settlers who left Gaza have chosen not to be reabsorbed. So you can still have this sore thumb that people can point to, that when we only removed 7,500, they still haven't been properly reintegrated, plus look how expensive it was, etc., etc. In this school year, the school year just started in Israel, the Jewish Israeli community, those who went into first grade, 52% went into Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox schools. We have different school systems. So this is not a demographic factor to be taken lightly. Over a year ago, one of the journalists who I respect greatly in Israel, Ofer Shelah, was quoting a figure of, it's a couple of years ago, 31% of the officer training class were coming from the Orthodox and settler sympathizer community in Israel. The point I'm making is, it's a pretty damned politically foreboding thing for an Israeli prime minister to take on, to go against that settler and settler sympathizer community. If an Israeli prime minister wakes up in the morning and thinks that the occupation, even if more likely defined than any of us would define it, is not a smart move strategically for Israel, it's a maintenance. And I think Olmert did sincerely think that. He knows, or she knows, but as he knows in the last decades, that you would have a huge fight on your hand to do anything about it. If you wake up in the morning and do nothing and you're either proactive about entrenching or just allow the inertia of occupation and settlement status quo to continue, nothing happens. That's a pretty easy political equation, especially in a politics where Israel is government by coalition. You've got to have 61 votes backing you on any given day, or your government falls. We've had 32 odd governments in 63 years. So that I mean, and I think without changing that incentive-disincentive structure, why would an Israeli prime minister do anything different? Secondly, it goes to a much deeper question of, I don't know what to call it, competing Zionist narratives, but certainly Israel's Zionistic self-understanding of us as a society, where there is a debate between, does post-67 settlement represent continuity or break? And the settler and pro-settler community are not entirely in cloud cuckoo land when they claim we did settlement before we had any state whatsoever, from the late 19th century until 48. We then had expansion of Jewish areas of settlement inside the state that we had from 48 to 67, and you had the Arab Israeli population under military government until 1966. The internally displaced persons within that Palestinian Arab community were never allowed to resurrect their villages or even return home, even if they're where they were living now as a displaced person and their original village were very close by. Of course there was no return. And what's the difference between that and continuing now to settle all of biblical Israel, Judea and Samaria? How can it be more logical, Jewishly, Zionistically speaking, to build Tel Aviv than to build in Hebron? Versus those who say no, something legitimate, recognized by the world as legitimate, was created in 48, and this project is an aberration. I would argue, and kind of this is kind of my angst from the Israeli progressive side, that latter argument is weak because we haven't built a progressive, inclusive Israeliness vis-a-vis the Palestinian Arab community in Israel. When we use the demographic argument rather than a moral or a democratic argument to oppose occupation, I think we fed into and seeded and grew this Liebermanist womb within us. So I just want to throw that out there because I think it's an important part of the conversation that goes on just below the surface most of the time in Israel. And ultimately, if we're talking about settlements, then really this entire process we're in now and the future will be in no small measure defined by, is there an Israeli government that is going to wake up one morning and remove a significant number of the settlers? I don't see any benefit in creating a hackneyed Bantustanish Palestinian whatever, that if some Palestinian leader wants to plant a flag there and ask for UN membership and say, hey, we've got a state, I don't see how that advances anything. I think that kind of instability and unsustainability is bad for Israel. So the kind of two-state space we're in these negotiations requires confronting the settlers. We are avoiding creating that choice again today over this non-extension of what anyway is a non-freeze. And I think if you're going to go that route, it's all about incentive and disincentive structures, and then there are other routes to go. If you can't physically remove the settlers, then Foreign Minister Lieberman spoke at the UN today. He said this must not be about land for peace, but rather exchange of populated territory. I'm not speaking about moving populations, but rather about moving borders to better reflect demographic realities. Now, to me, I don't like that, but if that's where he's going, then we're going 47, not 67. The only logical application of that is 47, is 181, 45-55 split, not 78-22 split. Or are we going to leave the settlers behind in a Palestinian state and have two multi-ethnic democracies? And that has implications for the equality of Palestinians inside Israel. It perhaps has implications for refugees being able to go back to their original communities. Or is it a one-state reality? But so much of it will be defined by how one approaches the settler question.
Thank you all very much. I just want to pose two questions to you that you can take whatever you want from them, respond to them in any way you wish, and then we'll open it up. The one thing that we heard constantly in the community of those who discussed Middle East policy when Obama was elected was that this was a president that was uniquely suited for this task, representing the United States, which has always stood in Israel's corner, but also having an appeal in the Arab and Muslim world. And we also heard at the same time that time is running out. If it's going to happen, it has to happen now. Here we are, 20 months into the Obama administration, with a catastrophic failure on the part of the Obama administration to get the Israelis to abide by something they agreed to 7 years ago and are obligated to do under international law. Why should any Palestinian leader have a reason to stay in these negotiations? The second question is, and I think Daniel brought this up, and the others did as well on the Palestinian end when it comes to the legitimacy question. Why does it seem that U.S. policy consistently takes sensitivities to Israeli domestic political concerns into account, but regularly ignores, rather foolishly, the dynamics on the Palestinian domestic scene? And so I'll leave you with those, whoever wants to start, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Sure.
Okay. All right. First of all, on the question you asked Yusuf about President Obama and this idea that he was uniquely suited to this task, I think that the present U.S. administration has relied excessively on who President Obama is, rather than what he does. I mean, and I'm just speaking. I can Middle East policy in general, but I mean, especially including on the Palestine issue. I think when I mentioned that, Obama's initial call for a settlement freeze was, I didn't think the administration had thought out what they were going to do when Netanyahu said no. It seems to me they had a sort of naive belief that when President Obama asked for a settlement freeze, it would be different because he's President Obama. And it turns out not to be different. So I'm afraid we've seen a repeat of that just in the last few weeks, thinking that, because these leaders came to Washington, surely they wouldn't embarrass the president just a few weeks later, by having the crisis that we're having now. And I don't know how many times this lesson is going to need to be learned, but I think that it has been a problem, and it seems like it continues to be a problem. Why do U.S. policymakers take Israeli domestic scene into account so much more than Palestinian domestic scene? I agree with you. I've written something about this a few months ago. This whole idea that I think the United States has behaved for a long time, and I trace this, at least 20 years back, although you could trace it further than that the United States somehow felt that Palestinian internal politics and were kind of dispensable. I mean, you could take them out when you need them and put them away when you don't need them, and that kind of thing, that they're not real. They don't really count for anything, and that most of the time over the past 20 years, with the exception of a couple of episodes, the United States has wanted to kind of avoid, defer, frustrate, internal Palestinian politics, and I see this as being a major, as having developed into a very, very big problem in terms of the workability of the very diplomatic process that the U.S. is sponsoring.
Well, maybe just very briefly, it really boils down to who's got the power and who's going to put a price and who's going to pay the price, and that applies to the Palestinians as well as the Israelis. I mean, as Daniel said, there's been no cost to the occupation, so why should it stop? I mean, and it's not just the Americans that haven't placed the cost; it's the Europeans. And they could, so if the Americans have a powerful domestic lobby that might not let them, the Europeans have a lobby, but it's not that powerful, and they could put a cost on this. Although I think probably the United States hasn't wanted them to, and that's what maybe they're a bit. But again, for the Palestinians, why not trample all over the Palestinians? I mean, for the U.S., because there's no cost. The Arabs aren't putting a cost to U.S. behavior. Palestinians aren't putting a cost to U.S. behavior. And you know, whatever the U.S. stops happening, the Palestinians accept. I mean, it's or pushes for, they accept. So we're you know, and then I want to take up just also what you said, Yusuf, about we've heard so often that time's running out. Well, time's running out for what? You know, I mean, if it's the idea, and this would have been really, I mean, I think Israel is extremely smart in the short term, but perhaps not as smart in the long term. There would have been an opportunity to wrap this thing up many times over the last 20 years on fantastic terms for them, which, you know, keep disappearing, and there's no guarantee that they will continue to enjoy the power that they do today. But the people I tend to blame, or, you know, hold the most responsible for this, are the Palestinians themselves, because, you know, they or we need to build ourselves up in ways rather than, you know, just go to where somebody else wants to take the movement or the organization, and that's, I think, where the real responsibility lies.
Can I just endorse what? Why stay in negotiations? You stay in negotiations if you're deep into a movement reality of having absolutely no capacity to develop an alternative strategy. Negotiations were a strategy. A mistaken one, a smart one that could have been pursued differently. But in the late 80s, PNC Algiers, Madrid, Oslo, I mean, you could certainly accuse the PLO leadership then of having had some strategic foresight in what they were doing. 17 years into an absolute incapacity of that model to deliver, of we make nice, yes, 22 from Algiers, absolutely. Of you know, America and the West will deliver Israeli deoccupation. If you've still got no alternative, now of course alternatives exist in Palestinian society. Some I find deeply offensive and objectionable when they involve targeting of Israeli civilians. Other alternatives that are not violent also exist, but you know, when unilateral declaration of statehood or boycott of settlement products are kind of an afterthought, and you can kind of turn it on or off, and it's not an alternative strategy. Of it, there's an, by definition, there's an asymmetry. If you've got a powerful state actor, who in this case is also an occupying power, and a non-state actor that also representing an occupied people. If on the other side there's a national liberation movement, that carries with it a certain, at least, sense of foreboding of kind of, don't fuck with us. I mean, we're not that anymore. It's not a national liberation movement with the narrative of a national liberation movement sitting opposite Israel. And why ignore Palestinian realities? There's no point going through the obvious reasons in terms of why America would ignore that. Palestinians make it so easy. And I'd also say, I don't think America does how you engage with Arab politics very well at all. It's not unique to the Palestinians. When you've got hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground, then, you know, because, well, who are these Sunni insurgents in Iraq? Maybe we start to deal with them, and even if they were shooting us yesterday, maybe we have to talk to them tomorrow. But if you can have the luxury of still ignoring Hamas, then you ignore.
Thank you. At this point, I want to open it up. If you can please wait till we get a microphone to you once you're called on, and keep your questions brief. Also, if you're directing your question to any member of the panel in particular, let us know that off the bat, and all the way in the back here.
I think Nadia brought up a great point of the asymmetry is also in the language and the narrative, which is of course very Zionist and Israeli. And so we shouldn't really talk about this as a peace process, because this is a pacification process. So there's a huge difference. This is really the negotiated surrender of the Palestinian people. And one question I don't quite understand, and maybe one of the three of you can answer it, is Abbas or anyone able to negotiate away the human rights and legal rights of Palestinians? For instance, a refugee family. If Abbas makes this fifth column agreement with the Israelis that they won't be allowed back, can a Palestinian family still lay claim to that land? And can we start using the language that better reflects the asymmetry, which isn't just military, but also legal? Because there's nothing to negotiate here. There's international law.
Do you want to take a cluster of questions, or
We can. Would you guys? Do you want to take a few at a time?
Yeah.
To
I think
try
so,
to
yeah,
accommodate
yeah.
more. Why don't we go right here, in the front.
yeah.
Well, you know, with all this
Yeah,
talk
just
about...
let us know who you are. Introduce
all right.
yourself.
I'm Joan Drake, formerly on the board of Partners for Peace and a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We have a section in Israel and a section in Palestine, as well as in the United States and elsewhere. I think we're taking our eyes off the ball. I think the focus is on the wrong question. You'll notice that the settlement progress in settling Judea and Samaria, which seems to be the Israeli goal, is also accompanied by a settling or or a weakening or a total destruction of the surrounding Arab states. For Iraq to fall after its prominence during the earlier part of this century and mid-20th century, for Beirut and Lebanon to be in ruins, for there to be threat of war and all kinds of destabilization of Iran, and you can go around the whole Arab community. I think that's what the real thing is. I think that's the real deal. And I think the focus on these phony settlement talks is part of the Israeli-U.S. scheme. I had three specific questions. One, I wanted someone to speak to the question of the French invitation. Sarkozy asked this week that the talks be moved to Paris, and he invited the leaders to come to Paris. I'd like to know what the State Department thinks about that, and how viable, and whether that was a real invitation. Two, I'd like to know why President Obama did not object and beg for reparations and an apology from Israel for the death of a U.S. citizen on the Mavi Marmara. I think that was a terrible, terrible lapse on his part, and certainly a strike against the presidency for anyone who cares about the life of U.S. Civilians. If that had been my grandson, I think I'd be, foaming at the mouth and at the gate of the White House now. And three, I had another question basically about well, let me just leave it at that, and I'll think my other question later.
We've got a lot to work with there. Let's go here, and then we're gonna try to respond to that.
I'm Najwan Dadle, Palestinian from Israel, and studying for my master in conflict resolution. I want to ask in terms of the inner Israeli domestic politics, because we know that the major motivation for the Israelis to conduct these kind of negotiation or to reach an agreement with the Palestinians is just to be able to create some kind of a Palestinian state in order to maintain Israel as a Jewish state. So it's a Zionist discourse. So what do you think, or how do you think it will implicate or have an influence on the future of this negotiation, because they will still have this demographic problem that they will have to deal with? So that's my question.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll just take the one very quickly, the one about can Abbas actually negotiate away Palestinian rights. And, that's what I mean about the danger of wrapping this thing up at a time when the Palestinians are as weak as they are today. Because I do think that if there is a peace deal that's signed off on by a Palestinian representative that's recognized as a Palestinian representative by the international community, even though not necessarily recognized as a Palestinian representative by the Palestinian people, and there is a seat at the UN and all of that, then one of Israel's first steps, which they've already tried to push on previous occasions, is to get rid of the whole body of international law that actually applies to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that's a real danger.
Maybe just to add a thought on that same issue.
Okay.
I mean, I think the refugee questions, of all of the so-called final status issues between Israel and Palestine, that's the one that's been the least worked, so to speak. And I think that, even more than Jerusalem, I think that the parties are the farthest apart on, and that worries me. That I don't know, Daniel, if you have anything to add on that. But I also, as you know, it's the PLO that's the negotiating party, not the Palestinian Authority. And the PLO is supposed to represent all Palestinians, including those Palestinians not, not living in Palestine. So technically, as the head of the PLO, President Abbas should be able to negotiate. But I think that Nadia has already pointed to the fact that, for example, he's been using the Arab League as a kind of cover to show that he has support, since he doesn't have the whole support of the Palestinian community. But I think it's increasingly difficult for him. That's why I was saying that I thought the extreme weakness on the Palestinian side made a resolution of all of the issues, and certainly this one, as much or more than any of the others, extremely difficult. Just briefly on the issue of the French president inviting the Israeli and Palestinian leaders to Paris, I haven't seen yet whether the State Department reacted to that. But the way I understood it was more of a short term. He was sort of trying to do his bit to get some sort of compromise out of them. Not that he was actually planning to, take over the peace process from the United States or something. Although if he wanted to, God bless him.
I think it's certainly I wouldn't go as far as to say that the real project here for Israel is to rip down the entire Arab world. I think there's Arab agency. I mean, the Arab states and Arab actors they are agents in these processes. So I think that's the major. That's what's mainly going on there. I really just want to relate to what Najwa was talking about. Because I think there is the emergence and strengthening of a progressive Jewish Israeli voice, which I would distinguish from the kind of classic Labour Zionist position, which is, great, if we can get the Palestinian state, whatever it is, wrap that up, put a bow around it, and then we can continue being our Jewish democratic Israel without ever really coming to terms with what that means. It's not like Israel was born yesterday. It's 63. We got to start. I mean, this is where I'm coming from, and Israel has to. What do those terms mean? I mean, when this administration and previous administrations just adopt, yes, a Jewish state. What do you mean by it? I think there's a reason that Israel calls itself the State of Israel, not the Jewish Republic of Israel or the Jewish Commonwealth of Israel. By the way, if Israel chose to go in that direction, then let's have that argument inside Israeli society. But we're not. And what worries me is that quite often you see when one's going down a peace process track, an ever more shrill and exclusivist rather than inclusivist and narrow nationalist trend inside Israel itself. Look, my attempt at optimism. I don't believe you can begin to heal Israeli Jewish society, build a progressive, inclusive, democratic vision of Israel, wean Israel off of the fear-mongering that its leaders have so irresponsibly indulged in, which is so easy to do against the backdrop of contemporary Jewish history. I think you can't do those while you're still maintaining an occupation. So my optimistic take would be if we could get a dignified deoccupation two-state outcome. I'm not saying Israel then becomes the democracy I'd like it to be, the inclusive democracy, but maybe you can kind of, people can breathe a little more, and you can begin to win that argument inside Israel. Intellectually, I can understand people who would say your better chance of achieving that, of achieving not just physical security and well-being for Israel's Jewish community, but a moral and spiritual well-being, is if you undergo that transformation into a multi-ethnic one-state democracy. I can understand that intellectually. It's not where I am emotionally, but I can't dismiss it.
Let's take just a couple more questions, but I know we have one from the online audience, so let's start with that.
We have two questions from the chat roll on our webcast. We have one from Mitchell Plitnick. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Will.
If current strategies are failures, and they certainly are, what are the alternatives? There needs to be something more than only a grassroots movement such as BDS anti-wall movements. And there's another question from Matt Gruber. Can there be room for the EU in this process?
And let's take one more from the floor and have our panel respond. Right up here in the front.
A week or so ago, a Jewish American professor said on the same platform here, tough love no longer works. And I asked John Mersheimer what did work, what should we do, and his answer was Obama should go out to the Jewish American community. That's very difficult. To Daniel Levy, is it possible that this whole process of peace should be thrown back into the Israeli public for a real debate? And I don't know exactly how you do it, maybe Obama at Hebrew University, whatever, but is this no longer a foreign policy that is made in domestic American policy? It is made in domestic Israeli policy.
Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think you do both. Peter Beinart, who many of you has an interesting new piece about how the American the institutions, traditional institutions of American Jewry are undermining this current peace effort. I believe that if this president had a kind of heart-to-heart with the American Jewish community, that he would carry the vast majority of that community with a genuine effort to put a plan on the table and resolve this. He spoke a language as a candidate, where he talked once in Cleveland, Ohio, about being pro-Israel shouldn't be confused with being pro-Likud. And it started to develop a different narrative, but that's not been borne out thus far in office. Bottom line, I agree with you. I think for this to work, for this iteration of a two-state effort to work, you have to place a clear choice in front of the Israeli public. So I do think the idea of America putting out a plan, unleashing that debate inside Israel, is a good idea. The plan would have to be the right plan. I mean, there are other ducks you've got to line up. I think it has to be comprehensive in the region, Syria. I think you've got to approach the Hamas question differently. So once I put all those riders on it, maybe it becomes just beyond political reach. I hope not, because I think I think if Israelis were confronted with a plan, but also with a degree of insistence that the question be answered, and with some sense, not necessarily of consequences for saying no to the plan, but consequences for continuing to violate international law and UN resolutions. Yeah. If you had all those ingredients, I actually have argued, and have written that I believe there is an Israeli political yes still in there, in the Israeli public and body politic, that we might still be able to coax out, but not in the way we're doing it at the moment.
Well, maybe just to quickly touch on the question of, if the current strategies are failures, what are the alternatives? I mean, I don't think obviously we can sit here and come up with strategies, but my personal preferred alternative would be for the Palestinian people to regroup, reunify, and have a real democratic institutions that represent them, have very clear, achievable common goals, and then find different sources of strength through which to back those. And I wouldn't, dismiss the grassroots struggle and the BDS as being ineffective. I mean, they are effective, but they, by themselves, they do not constitute where I agree is by themselves, they do not constitute an entire alternative strategy. But without a reunified body politic and without a very, very clear set of common achievable goals, I don't think you can get very far.
I want to agree with Daniel about the idea of the U.S. putting a plan on the table. This is something that's been talked about increasingly, and I think if the Obama administration is serious about wanting to pursue a two-state solution, then that is what they will do at some point, maybe early next year or something like that, after either these talks resume and limp along for a few more months, or don't resume. But I don't hold out a lot of hope for the talks the way they are. I think a further step will be necessary. I think it is time for the U.S. to put a plan on the table, and as Daniel said, to insist that the question be answered. And I think that President Obama should visit. I think he should visit Israel and Palestine. I think it was a mistake that he didn't do that in the first year when he visited Cairo. I do think he needs to put this question directly to both the parties, especially the Israelis. Just briefly on this question of can there be room for the EU? I just came from Europe 2 days ago. I was at a conference of people talking about the Middle East and Europe, and I'm always reminded when I'm there how disunited the Europeans are amongst themselves, about these issues. So a negotiating role, not really, and I always think they're terribly timid somehow in, with the United States. I mean, there's an endless or bottomless well of guilt, European guilt, it would seem, and they pay and pay and pay, but they, and I think some of the Europeans are feeling a bit sheepish now because they feel in a way that President Obama did what they advised him to do, and it hasn't gone well. And they're not quite sure where to go from here. So I wish the EU would play more of a role, not necessarily in seizing the diplomatic initiative away from the United States, but in engaging more effectively and more seriously with the other parties and with the United States, and not being quite so timid.
Well, thank you all very much for your comments today, and I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panel.